Hey all, Ron Coddington from Military Images Magazine, coming to you live from our world headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. I hope you all are doing well and having a great weekend. For those of you who tuned in earlier this week to our Collectors Showcase, sponsored by Military Images Magazine and Civil War Talk, I hope you enjoyed the presentations, the rapid rounds of 5-minute presentations, where 9 collectors shared a favorite image from their collection. One of the takeaways, one of the comments that I have had from folks is that the images that the collectors showed weren't necessarily the best images in their collections, but they were images that were important to them for other reasons. There was an interesting story about them. And I thought that was an interesting observation by many folks. So I think it also speaks to collecting images. We tend to showcase those amazing images of soldiers that are armed and sailors and all of that, but it's not always necessarily those eye-catching images. So want to say, hey, I see Jeff is here. Clarence from Ontario, Canada. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're simulcasting, by the way, on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. So wherever you're watching us, I really appreciate you tuning in. So I want to jump into tonight's program. I might call it tonight's presentation because we've got, this is what I'm going to show you is the result of a couple of days of research on and off to learn more about the photograph you're seeing right now. And this gentleman, these two gentlemen, on the left is a chaplain, and he has he's wearing what appears to be the approved chaplain's uniform with the subdued buttons, no official rank, there's no shoulder straps. And so it's that subdued look that chaplains had beginning in late 1861. The gentleman, the taller gentleman next to him, is wearing shoulder straps. He's clearly an officer. On the back of the image, we've got some good information to dig into. At the top, bold in ink in what appears to be period writing, is Chaplain Foster and Captain George Sinclair. Another valuable piece of information is the photographer's imprint, T.W. Banks, photographic artist. If you know Civil War photography, or if you're a student of the photographers, you know that T.W. Banks is Thomas W. Banks, an English immigrant to the United States who settled in Arkansas, in Helena, Arkansas, before the war. And so we can attribute this image to his studio in Helena. Now, question becomes, who are Foster and Sinclair? I started out with Foster, with Chaplain Foster, and I spent a significant amount of time looking for chaplains with the last name of Foster that were connected to Helena at some point in time during the war. And there's a limited number of Union regiments that were there, which includes volunteer regiments and a little bit later on, the U.S. colored troops. I could find no one named Foster that served as a chaplain. So I did some searching, and I found that the Butler Center of Arkansas Studies has this image in its collection, which is an exact duplicate of the one that I started out by showing you. This image is in a little bit rougher condition. It's a bit more muted. However, it has an interesting bit of information. So I have this image, as you can see here, and you can tell that it's a little darker, but it appears to be the same exact print. On the back of the image is this bit of information. It says, from J.G. Forman, post chaplain, Helena, Arkansas. Now notice it also has the T.W. Banks imprint. So this is important stuff because we now can confirm through these two photographs that the Banks backmark is pretty good confirmation that this is from Helena, Arkansas. To confirm it even further, we have the inscription of J.G. Forman, post-chaplain of Helena. Now, the question comes up is, how come the first image that I showed you says Chaplain Foster, and here we have J.G. Forman? Both appear to be in period ink. And so my theory here is that the image that says Chaplain Foster is something that was added by some other person who might not have known the chaplain. You'll notice that that person did not use the chaplain's first name, only called him Chaplain Foster. This image I'm putting a heavier weight on. I should say this inscription I'm putting a heavier weight on because it says from J.G. Forman. This was clearly written by him. And we have another key bit of information. He identifies himself as post-chaplain of Helena, Arkansas. So this guy is very easy to find. His name is John Gilbert Forman. He was born in Canada in 1820. He was an abolitionist. There's no question about that. Even as a young man, there's evidence that supports his interest in abolitionism. Here's a letter that he wrote. It's in the collection of the Boston Public Library, and he's writing to William Lloyd Garrison. This is in 1852, and Forman is a 32-year-old man. He refers to William Lloyd Garrison as my friend. Whether or not that was using as an acquaintance or as a brother in the abolitionist movement is something that I haven't yet to understand. But I can tell you that it's clear, it's evidenced by this letter, that there's a connection between William Lloyd Garrison and Forman, and the familiar way, yet respectful way that Forman writes to Garrison suggests that there's some sort of a connection along the way. Now, interestingly, Forman becomes a Unitarian minister in Massachusetts, and some of the reporting that I found, some of the research I found, suggests that he had a falling out with the congregation in his church over the slavery question. And although I didn't find out exactly why, I can tell you that because of this letter, it leads me to believe that Forman's views on the abolition of slavery were growing more intense over time, and perhaps there were folks in his congregation that did not have the same strong feeling. What I do know is that about 5 years after he writes this letter, he leaves Massachusetts. And where does he go? He goes to Alton, Illinois. Now, Alton is just north, about 75 miles north of St. Louis. So hang on to that connection there of Alton and St. Louis. Alton, he becomes a member of the Unitarian Church there. More than a member, he apparently is leading a church there. And some evidence suggests that it's more favorable. He has a more favorable response from the congregants in Alton, Illinois, than he did in Massachusetts. So he might have remained in Alton for some period of time. However, the war comes along. At this point, he's probably been in Alton about 4 years, and he joins the war effort. He becomes the chaplain of the 3rd Missouri Infantry. That regiment formed in St. Louis. So there's your St. Louis-Alton connection. He probably went south, found the chaplaincy open in St. Louis, which is the big city, and then he goes ahead and joins. He apparently is somewhat in demand, And I'm not sure if it's because of his charismatic ways or because he wants to become involved. But in a short period of time, he is functioning as the superintendent of refugees in St. Louis because we now have a crisis during the war. All of these displaced, enslaved people are moving north. So he's the superintendent of refugees in St. Louis. He also becomes secretary of the Western Sanitary Commission, and put a bookmark on that because I'll talk about that connection a little bit later. Now, about a year later, in December 1862, December 29th, 1862 to be exact, Forman and two others are now, guess what? They're in Helena, and they have become, they have found information about violence against the enslaved people, the freedmen's, or, and using the term of the period, the contrabands who have fled into Union lines, mistreatment of these people by Union soldiers. The letter is important enough for me to read it to you. I found it in this brochure, this publication called Civil War 150, reader number 4, From Slavery to Freedom. Here is the page that transcribes the letter. I'm going to read you just a little bit of it. And so here it is. It's Helena, Arkansas, December 29th, 1862. It is written to the general commanding the Department of Missouri, Samuel R. Curtis. And so it starts out by saying, General, the undersigned chaplains and surgeons of the Army of the Eastern District of Arkansas would respectfully call your attention to the statements and suggestions following the contrabands within our lines who are experiencing hardships, oppression, and neglect, the removal of which calls loudly for the intervention of authority. We daily see and deplore the evil and leave it to your wisdom to devise a remedy. In a great degree, the contrabands are left entirely to the mercy and rapacity of the unprincipled part of our army, excepting only the limited jurisdiction of a Captain Richmond, with no person clothed with specific authority to look after and protect them. Among their list of grievances, we mention these, and this is where it becomes pretty specific. Here we go. Some who have been paid by individuals for cotton or for labor have been waylaid by soldiers, robbed, and in several instances fired upon, as well as robbed, and in no case that we can now recall have the plunderers been brought to justice. The wives of some have been molested by soldiers to gratify their licentious lust, and their husbands murdered in endeavoring to defend them, and yet the guilty parties, though known, were not arrested. Some who have wives and families are required to work on the fortifications or to unload government stores and receive only their meals at the public table, while their families, whatever provision is intended for them, are, as a matter of fact, left in helpless and starving condition. Many of the contrabands have been employed and received in numerous instances from officers and privates only counterfeit money or nothing at all for their services. One man was employed as a teamster by the government, and he died in the service. The government indebted to him nearly $50, leaving an orphan child 8 years old, and there is no apparent provision made to withdraw the money or to care for the orphan child. There's more. The Negro Hospital, as it's referred to here, has become notorious for filth, neglect, mortality, and brutal whipping, so that the contrabands have lost all hope of kind treatment there and would almost as soon go to their graves as to their hospital. Now, Foreman and the rest of the committee add some sourcing to this. These grievances reported to us by persons in whom we have confidence, and some of which we know to be true, are but a few of the many wrongs of which they complain. Now, his training and education experience as a Unitarian minister kicks in. He says, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of Christianity, for the good name of our army, for the honor of our country, cannot something be done to prevent this oppression and to stop its demoralizing influences upon the soldiers themselves? That's pretty damning information. I have not been able to yet find out what became of this, I'll call it a petition of sorts. I don't know how it was acted upon, if it was acted upon. There's more research to be done here, but for sure, this is a damning letter, and one that must have caught the attention of Major General Curtis and the authorities. So I've given you some information about Foreman, and now I want to switch back to George Sinclair, the captain. Why are these two individuals pictured together? That's a little bit of a mystery, but if you look into Sinclair's life and military service, you might be able to see a connection, or at least suggest a connection. Sinclair, he was a private in a Missouri cavalry regiment, the 1st Missouri. And so you've got a Missouri regiment that George Sinclair serves in. You have a Missouri regiment that Foreman serves in. So you've got that connection there. Also interesting to know that George Sinclair is from Yatesville, in the vicinity of Yatesville in Illinois, which is not all that far from Alton. So you've got that connection. The two men did not live all that far apart from one another before the war began. It's very possible that Sinclair was a Unitarian and was in the same church. That's speculation on my part. I haven't been able to find that because Sinclair's record is really rather sketchy. What I can tell you is that a few months after Chaplain Forman's letter is sent to Major General Curtis, a new regiment forms in Helena, and that's the 1st Regiment Arkansas Infantry of African descent. It later becomes the 46th U.S. Colored Infantry. The captain of Company I of the 1st Arkansas is, yes, it's George Sinclair. So Sinclair goes from private in a Missouri cavalry regiment to the captain of a African descent regiment, better known later on as a U.S. Colored Infantry Regiment. So his commission arrives in May of 1863. He doesn't remain with the regiment very long, about 7 months or so. He resigns in January of 1864, and he talks about his wife being in poor health and having some young children. He doesn't give her name. He doesn't give the number and the names of the children or their ages. So I did a little bit of research, and I found a marriage between George Sinclair and Mildred S. Sinclair, which happened in Morgan County, which is in Illinois, which is Yatesville and the surrounding area. And so there's a marriage that happened in 1859, assuming the children were produced or a product of their union, their wedding, then that would explain how they might have a few young children by early 1864. Interesting detail is I have not been able to find any mention of a Mildred Sinclair. I have not been able to find a grave site, no reference to her after her marriage in 1859. So it is very possible that George Sinclair's marriage ends with her death from whatever illness she was suffering in early 1864. It remains to be seen. Another situation where there's more work to be done. Sinclair himself doesn't live all that much longer. He dies in 1874 at about age 39. He's buried in Hebron Cemetery in the town of Sinclair, which may be named for some family member, could be named for him, I don't know. And Sinclair is located near Yatesville. So again, you've got that tie-in to the Yatesville area of Illinois. So that's sort of the end of his story, at least for now, until we find more information. If you're wondering about Foreman and how his story ends, after the war is over, he musters out in November of 1865, and he goes back to Massachusetts. I haven't found any record that he remains in St. Louis or remains in Illinois. He goes back and decides to go back to school to become a doctor. So he attends Harvard and stays there for a while. And I'm not sure yet if he graduates, but I have him documented at Harvard studying medicine. In 1869, so less than 4 years after he leaves the Army, he opens a drugstore in Lynn, Massachusetts. There's no evidence that I could find that he has returned to the ministry. He operates his drugstore until he dies in 1885. He's about 65 years old when he passes. And along the way, he's had 2 wives and 5 children. So he really sort of disappears after about 1869, which is a bit unusual when you consider a man of his abilities and a man of all of his activities leading up to and during the war. He just sort of drops off. There's very little, there's really nothing of him that I've found so far after 1869, other than his death in 1885. So he did leave behind a couple of items. This photograph, as a visual reference, is certainly a big item, and that helps us to understand what he looked like, his role in Helena at the time, and helped me to be able to learn about this story around what happened in Illinois. But he also, in Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas. But what he did also leave behind was some writings. One of them is a book of common prayer that he published. And you'll notice it's in Alton, Illinois in 1863. So it's a collection of hymns and national anthems. So it's an interesting combination of patriotism and religion that intersect in this hymnal public worship book. So this is published in 1863. A big book that he writes is a history of the Western Sanitary Commission. If you're not familiar with the Western Sanitary Commission, it's the counterpart of the U.S. Sanitary Commission that is basically east of the Mississippi. The Western Sanitary Commission is another huge organization. The 2 organizations are related. And you may recall that I mentioned how Forman becomes secretary of the Western Sanitary Commission during his time in St. Louis. St. Louis is where the Western Sanitary Commission is born, is conceived of, with the help of John Fremont and his wife and others in the area who are dealing with this humanitarian crisis. So Forman writes this book that's published in 1864 while the Sanitary Commission is still doing its thing. So the last book I want to bring your attention is this one. And it happens in 1867. A few years later, Woman's Work in the Civil War, a record of heroism, patriotism, and patience, is a book about women and their role as nurses. It's roughly the equivalent of a regimental history for Civil War nurses. Now, Foreman is not the author on this. The co-authors are Linus Brockett and Mary Vaughan. But Foreman contributed a number of sketches of women from the West who participated in and made sacrifices and helped all of the sick and wounded in the St. Louis area. And not only did Foreman contribute, but his wife also contributed. So some fascinating connections from Chaplain Forman to the history of the Western Sanitary Commission, to what was going on in Helena, the mistreatment of contrabands or enslaved people coming into the Union lines. And all of this comes from a single photograph, investigations into a single photograph. So as I was going through this, going down the research rabbit hole to uncover all of this information, I couldn't help but think about all of the members of the Civil War collecting community and the wonderful things that they do to research photographs and be able to tell the stories behind them. And certainly the 9 individuals, our 9 panelists who participated last week in the Civil War Collector Showcase. So this, I think you could add to the list of another example where an existing surviving photograph of a Civil War soldier, in this case, a chaplain and a captain in the U.S. Colored Infantry, help us to better understand the nuances and the complexities and military, political, and cultural threads that were going on at the time. So really appreciate you listening tonight. We'll be back with a new video at some point, but until then, take care.